one of those introductions where you go, wow, what a guy, great guy. Dr. Brian Little is an internationally acclaimed scholar and speaker in the field of personality and motivational psychology. His pioneering research, I underline pioneering research, it doesn't mean he's old, it just means he's really experienced, on how everyday personal projects and free traits influence the course of our lives has become an important way of explaining and enhancing human flourishing. Professor Little is currently at Cambridge University, where he is a fellow of the Well-Being Institute and director of the Social Ecology Research Group in the Department of Psychology. He is also affiliated with the Cambridge Judge Business School and the Psychometrics Center at Cambridge. Previously, he taught at McGill, Oxford, and Harvard universities. And I, having myself attended Yale University, I will not hold that against him. His course on personality in Harvard's Department of Psychology was immensely popular, and he was elected as a favorite professor by the graduating classes of Harvard for 3 consecutive years. It's an incredible honor once, but 3 times in a row. Dividing his time between Canada and the United Kingdom, Brian is also a distinguished research professor emeritus at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada, and he lectures worldwide on personality, motivation, and well-being. Let's say hello and welcome him to the series, Dr. Brian Little. Hey, Brian.
Hi, David. Thanks for that lovely introduction.
Hi, you're very welcome. Thanks for living a life that's worthy of such a long introduction, right? That's awesome. So, hey, we have a couple questions for you that we wanted to share with everybody before we start. And one of them is just right off the introduction, where you were voted one of the favorite professors in all of Harvard, and that's quite an accomplishment. Many of us are teachers and therapists and coaches and trainers. What advice could you give us that we can apply to our own work as teachers, presenters, educators, from your own experience as being one of the best teachers really in the world?
Oh, what an interesting question. I look at teaching as the as a kind of kindling effect. It's having highly combustible students and throwing out a flame so that combustion takes place. And I was immensely fortunate at Harvard to have a whole bunch of combustibility in the room when I would come in. They were just waiting to have something light them up. And consequently, it all happened. So I don't think it's just a matter of a sage on the stage. I think that there does need to be some kind of interaction between the professor and the students. The question of whether you should just be yourself is a really puzzling one, and I have maybe an unconventional answer to it, which I'll explain in my presentation. And that is that sometimes I think we have to act out of character. And so I know at Harvard the students thought that I was an over-the-top extrovert. But in fact, I am probably one of the most biogenically introverted professors you could imagine. And we have strange ways of handling ourselves. And I'm handling myself that way right now. But I'm not going to tell you what the secret is.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you know, one of the things when you say that, it makes us, all of us who are either introverts or extroverts, feel that confident that we have a place in front of our students or our clients. They're just different. You're going to help us figure out how to do it best. One of the things, one of our most beloved professors, Chris Peterson, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, I'd asked him, like you, very funny guy, and asked him, you know, what was his, you know, what did he do, or was it all natural? And he actually talked about how he read joke books when he was an early professor, just really queuing up building his character strength of humor, and turned out to be one of the most funny guys that I know. And one of the questions that's been asked behind the scenes here, Brian, is for you bring so much humor in everything you do. Is that natural? Is it something that you work on? Is it both?
You know, I've never been able to tell a joke in my life, and so anything that I do by way of humor is completely spontaneous, and it arises out of looking around the classroom and seeing people committing data all over the place. People who look a little nervous, people who are excited because they brought their ex-boyfriend to the class. When you notice that and you play upon it, the humor just comes spontaneously. And unlike the late and much beloved Chris Peterson, I could never have read a joke book because I would never have remembered the joke.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that. One of the things that's nice about our series is we want to make you as a leader in the field to be accessible to everyone. So getting to know you a little bit is really, really awesome. And thank you.
Thank you.
We have a couple, you bet. We have some more questions for you, but we're going to save them for after your presentation. One of them is an interest in your personal connection to personal projects. And so if that comes up in your presentation, great. Like, how did you come to such a discovery that is as important as the power of personal projects? So interested in that. We also have the magic wand questions, but we'll save those for later on.
Sounds great.
All right, Brian, you ready to go?
I am.
Okay, we'll queue up your presentation with our technical team right now and get you driving the slides.
Okay, just tell me when I'm ready to go and I will go.
All right, our team from behind Sydney and is looking at those slides right now to bring those up, change presenters. And Brian, while we're waiting for that to happen, could you tell us real quick what you would say, was the personal story that drove you to, discover, was there a personal story that drove you to discover the power of personal projects, something that you've done a ton of research on, but how did you get there originally?
Well, there is actually a bit of a story, and I might be able to allude to it in my presentation, but I was really influenced by George Kelly and the psychology of personal constructs. And I felt that he had an enormously capacious view of the human condition, but that it needed something a little more. And by shifting the discourse from personal constructs to personal projects, I found that I was able to get more distance and yet retain the magic that was George Kelly.
Oh, that's great. That is super. Awesome. Well, we're ready to roll. And Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thanks for sharing your insights with us today. And here you go.
Great. Well, thank you. This is an absolute delight and certainly an honor. And my understanding is that there may be people from 33 different countries listening in. And that is so rewarding. And I hope to do justice to you by speaking at least 27 different languages in my presentation today, which will end in 2 weeks. Now, here is my the title, Acting Out of Character, Free Traits, Personal Projects, and Well-Doing. But let me launch right into what I want to achieve in the 21 minutes, 18 seconds at my disposal. I want to talk about human flourishing, and my students and colleagues and I have recently started talking about well-doing, which is a shift away from well-being, and particularly subjective well-being, and getting into almost a more Aristotelian tinted sense of what human flourishing is about. And so I occasionally will use the word doing. It is not pronounced well-doing, which some of my students tried, but well-doing. What is it that we do well? And when we ask of people, how's it going? How are you doing? What is the nature of the answer? And I'm going to argue that one of the key and pivotal points in their answer to that question is the personal projects they are engaged in their life. These may be things that they are fully engaged in at present, things that they're anticipating prospectively, things that they've started but haven't been able to complete, and all manner of daily doings that comprise our lives. As a part of this perspective on personality and well-being, I'm going to talk about free traits. And these are contrasted, as you'll see in a minute, with relatively fixed traits. So a free trait, to me, is the enactment of a social script that advances a personal project that matters to you. And so when David was asking me about lecturing at Harvard, my biogenic trait happens to be very introverted. My free trait is extroversion. Why? Because of a personal project that matters dearly to me, which is to get my students excited. And so I'm not rare. Many of us are like that. And I want to discuss not only what free traits do by way of shaping lives, but the costs and benefits of acting out of character. And acting out of character has two meanings. Acting out of character means acting against the way you normally are. But it also means acting on the basis of our character, on the basis of values that matter to us in our lives. So let me advance this now. Don't get daunted by the number of bidirectional arrows and boxes. This is not meant to be daunting. It's just to give you the lay of the land on where I'm going. So essentially, in box F, which conveniently stands for flourishing or well-doing, that has been a focus of our research since, I would think, the early 1970s. And we were looking then at hedonic and eudaimonic well-being and other things, which I'll get to in a second when I pull each of these boxes out. And as you can see from the model, and I hope you can see my little cursor here, I see the flourishing and well-being and well-doing as influenced by stable traits of personality and other characteristics that are relatively enduring biogenic sources of our behavior, and also by sociogenic sources, the stable contextual features. In turn, there are dynamic aspects of people and contexts, and then what I call idiogenic sources of the self, idiogenic sources of human flourishing. And these are aspects of personality that endure through the projects that we pursue. And I'll say a bit more about that when I explode these boxes and take you to that. In fact, let's do that right now. Flourishing. The one thing I'll say at the outset about human flourishing is that it is contestable and it is complex. And it is also contingent upon place, time, historical epoch, and so on. And flourishing can be looked at not only in terms of subjective well-being. My students and I look at hedonic and eudaimonic well-being. We look at physical, social, emotional, and relational well-being. But we also are concerned about, theoretically, consequential outcomes, such as accomplishments, creative performance, and so on. And I don't know whether this is distinctive, but it's important for me that we also look at the impact on the ecosystem. And we started postulating this in the late 1970s in an article I wrote with Tom Ryan, where we were concerned that if the sustainable pursuit of core projects in our lives is what really matters, and I'll go on to argue today that it is, then if we don't have an ecosystem that's sustainable, we're going to find ourselves in real difficulty. And so I think it's sort of comforting to see the saliency and the importance of ecosystems emerging in our discourse about the human condition in recent decades. Now, let me go to expose the next of these, which is the biogenic sources, which I see as having a direct impact upon human flourishing. And this is hardly novel. We've studied, as many others have, the impact of the big five traits of ocean, as we call it, openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, neuroticism, on flourishing. And we know that openness has a direct impact upon consequential outcomes related to creativity and creative accomplishment. We know that conscientiousness is very much related to other kinds of outcomes that may be a little bit more normatively expected and typical performance rather than highly creative. We know that extroversion has a positive impact, but that it's very much a contentious, and as I said before, contestable notion, that link between extroversion and flourishing, and I'll explain why it's contentious in a minute. Agreeableness and neuroticism also have their impacts upon flourishing. So this is direct influence. But as we'll see, there is also a dynamic or free trait aspect. And those free traits arise as a result of the more biogenic dispositions that you have. And maybe a hereditary base is certainly posited, and there's a lot of evidence relating to that. But free traits modulate the impact of those more biogenic stable traits in ways that I think help us understand human flourishing in a more effective fashion. And they also have, these dynamic free traits have an impact upon flourishing. The sociogenic sources would be such things as cultural norms and social roles, and they have a direct impact upon human flourishing. Remember, I mentioned that extroversion may be contentious as a direct influence on human flourishing. Those of you familiar with the book by Susan Cain called Quiet will know that she has talked about the cultural norm of extroversion as having had an impact upon life, particularly in America, that may be problematic for those who have more biogenic traits of introversion. And she has started what she calls a quiet revolution to energize and to bring into a greater sense of contribution to life those who are more introverted in nature. So in a way, it's nurturing the nature through challenging the cultural norms. Social roles also enjoin us to act in certain ways, so that we can't just say that a person has, sorry, I keep flipping over there. I've got a very lively screen. So that the cultural roles, and the cultural norms and the social roles will create expectations for us to act in certain ways. And they will have an impact also on our personal construing of our contexts. It's not just the social constructed nature external to us, but our own personal construing, what I call our personal context. I'm not going to have time to discuss that today, but in the book, Me, Myself, and Us, Science of Personality and the Art of Well-Being, I have a chapter on how places, the cities we live in, and our construing of them have an impact upon our flourishing. And that in turn has an impact. What is most crucial for me are the idiogenic sources. So biogenic, arising from the biological nature, sociogenic, arising from our socially and culturally constructed sources, and idiogenic from the same root as idiosyncratic, meaning singular pursuits that matter to us. I developed the notion of personal projects in the late 70s, published in the early 80s in 1983, and very quickly after those were published, Nancy Cantor adopted the methodology of personal projects to look at life tasks. Bob Emmons adopted it to look at personal strivings, and I see personal projects as being somewhere in between. Nancy's life tasks, which are the socially and sociogenically constructed enjoinders to act in certain ways, typically age-graded. What do you do when you're 18 years of age? And Bob Emmons' personal strivings, which are more along the lines of this set of influences. And so the shading here reflects the relative saturation with life tasks, with personal projects that are life tasks being more culturally attuned, personal projects that are more strivings, more linked to our biogenic traits. And those, in fact, are all interrelated, and if you wish to know more about that, I do have some references, which we'll make available after the presentation is given. So I want to now go into personal projects in more detail. What are they? They're extended sets of personally salient action. For example, listening to Little's webcast is a personal project. even if the source of it may not be exactly what I may think it is. For example, because my advisor told me to, maybe the reason you're listening in today. Personal projects analysis, or PPA, is a complicated and complex, but I think nuanced and granular way of looking at the nature of our daily life. As I say, we developed it in the late 70s, early 80s, and the methodology, and I'm not going to emphasize the methodology today. I can't with the time constraint, but I'm giving you some things to look at for those of you, particularly with the research orientation. We look at the content, the appraisal, the impact, and the dynamics of personal project pursuits. Here are some examples of the content of personal projects. The very first one we got from university students, which we started gathering in the late 70s. Here was the first project that we saw: clarify my philosophy of life. And I thought, wow, isn't that impressive? I would have thought maybe something a bit more Animal House might have been the first project listed. But I saw that as an expression of a striving for a eudaimonic take on one's collegiate life. But then the next project we saw was Get Laid, which seemed to me to pretty well, the pair of them, convey the ups and downs, the delights, and the diversions of undergraduate collegiate life. Here are some others. What's the most frequent project we see? Something on the order of lose 10 pounds. I began to worry, given the number of people who had this as a core project, that people may, that there may be sufficient tonnage liberated in these weight loss projects that it may actually affect the trajectory of Earth's axis. Suffice to say that losing 10 pounds or some variation on it is a very, very frequent personal project. I have more to say about that in a minute. It's also a place in which you can get more idiosyncratic ones. Isn't this a lovely personal project? Be a better druid. Be a druid is one, but be a better druid sort of struck me as utterly singular and demanding and challenging for a person who perhaps doesn't live near trees. Repair My Guilt was a project that intrigued us because we started early on at looking at personal project pursuits in different cultures. We didn't want it just to be weird people, which would be white, educated, intelligent, and all the, you may have heard of that weird description of individuals that are the typical undergraduate students that we get in our studies. We wanted to look, in this case, at China. And this was China during the Cultural Revolution. Actually, it was just after the Cultural Revolution. And the churches had been back in, had been opened up again. And so we were just gathering some data, comparing them to Canadian data. And this one came up, Repair My Guilt. Now, I thought, well, the translation's a little off, isn't it? But I thought, isn't it intriguing? Could it have to do with the recrudescence of the guilt-inducing spiritual essence of their lives, and we were going back and forth in the lab talking about this theoretically. And then I thought, I always like to get back to the raw data. And we found that actually there'd been a slight transcription mistake. It was not Repair My Guilt, it was Repair My Quilt. And I think that really does change the nature of the project. Maybe not quite so intriguing, but certainly for that person, very important. Sometimes the way we frame a project and phrase it augurs ill or well for its likely completion, maybe apologizing to my boss. Neil Chambers, a brilliant linguist who worked on a PhD with me to look at the language of personal projects, has talked about people who frame their projects in this way and shown brilliantly how the very way we phrase our projects may be more or less conducive to actually carrying them out effectively. Sometimes the sequencing of projects is enlightening. Get my pilot license, get a water bed, going to Colorado, going to the Bahamas, and then get out of debt. which seems to me to be a consequential aspect of the other projects. Here are some more. Become more extroverted is a particularly interesting one, because what this does is it points us in the direction of fixed and free trades. Here's somebody who's actually mounting a project of trying to be what they are not, try to be more extroverted. And we'll see that that's a very interesting kind of project in a few minutes. Put out the dog may seem rather inconsequential, but it's not. If you're on crutches and the building code hasn't been respected in your condo or in your apartment, so put out the dog may seem like a trivial pursuit, but it's not a trivial pursuit depending upon the conjunction of the personal attributes on the one hand and the environmental attributes on the other. So in these examples, I want you to harken back to the general flow model to show how these things, the person and the situation and the affordances and the capacities merge in these everyday personal projects. Help my mom through Alzheimer's. Many of the people who we are talking to now, who we've studied in senior management, are going through these kinds of projects. Help my mom. Help my daughter. Understand my spouse better. These are consequential tasks. Continue to grow as a person and find contentment in everyday life. We have ways of looking at, in our methodology, the likelihood of successful projects progress in these projects. And that is not one that is likely to be managed as well as another project. I thought Let My Fingernails Grow would be a pretty good example. And I illustrated it as a trivial pursuit. And I got roundly scorned by one of my students who wrote a disquisition on the cultivation of nail cultivation and fingernail growth. And it certainly put me in my place. Who are we to judge the triviality of other people's personal projects? Sometimes the way we talk about these projects to others is consequential. Tell my brother to get rid of his sickening girlfriend, and then this was followed in this particular case by think before I say something stupid. So at least a certain degree of self-awareness is coming in. And my final one that I'll give is fill in a sinkhole in the yard before Fred gets home. A lovely example that I got from Neil Chambers. And this was somebody who was having Fred was having cardiac surgery and was going to come home in a few days. And the woman, his wife, had noticed a sinkhole in the yard, which happened to be about 6 foot deep. And he decided that it might be propitious to fill it in before Fred thought that it may have been meant for him or the late him, as the case might be. And then I will say, give a webinar for the IPA folks, which is what you're doing. And also, don't give too many examples of personal projects, because I could spend 5 hours just telling you what they're like. Now, the 5-factor model of projects, these are now the appraisals. We've had the content. These are the appraisals. We get people to rate their projects on about 17 to 20 dimensions, including such things as how important are they, the extent to which they are really you, to what extent is James' project truly Jamesian, to what extent is Elizabeth's truly Elizabethan. And we call that project meaning. And the greater the project meaning in your overall set of projects, the greater measures subjective well-being are, as you might expect. Project manageability, how much efficacy are you experiencing in this project? How much control do you have over it? These are also good predictors of subjective well-being and of various measures relating to life satisfaction. Efficacy in particular, a la Bandura, is very important, the single best positive predictor of well-being in project indicators. Project connection. To what extent are the projects connecting you with other individuals? Visibility. Are there people aware of your projects? Support. Do others support you? Do you support others in the project? We look at both aspects, both giving and taking, as Adam Grant would have us say. Enjoyment and joy, the positive affect dimensions. negative affect, how much stress and anxiety in your projects. Now, these are just two representative dimensions for each of the major factors. And I will say just a couple of things before moving on to some other substantive points. We have posited, and I think we can see at an individual consulting level, meaning manageability trade-offs. You may have projects that are drenched in meaning, but are utterly chaotic. Or you can have well-managed projects. They are slick as can be, but they're bereft of any meaning for you. And so that meaning manageability trade-off is an empirical possibility and is theoretically rather intriguing. Also, for those more on the research side, but those of you who have puzzled over eudaimonic and hedonic well-being, are they better seen as correlated aspects of well-being, or are they better treated as separate ones? In our original work, we found that enjoyment of projects and value congruency and self-identity of your projects, which were more on the eudaimistic side, were pretty well would co-vary together. Similar to the kind of argument that that several people have been making recently about the need not to push the distinction too hard between eudaimonic and hedonic well-being. However, in recent studies, particularly with studies we've carried out in Portugal and comparative studies in Canada, we've shown that when you put in a sufficient number of affective dimensions, eudaimonic and hedonic well-being are in fact separated out as different factors. To us, it's an empirical question. It is not an a priori theoretical, canonical concern. I thought you might be interested in seeing how we can put the content and the dimensions or appraisals of projects together. Now, this was done with a whole school that we studied in Canada in the mid-1980s, and we showed we were looking at what are the projects that adolescents really identify with? What are the ones which they can say, this is me when I'm engaged in them? And on the positive ones, these are the most positive ones now, on a mean score from 0 to 10, sports was very high. Higher still, boyfriend-girlfriend relationships. And then we had to break something else out because of its frequency, which was sex, which is a little bit higher than the relationship it appears in this group of students. Is there anything bigger than sports and friends and sex? Yes, there is. Spiritual projects. Now, don't be fooled by those means are high, but the frequency of these projects was not as high as those in the other categories. So spiritual, the most self-identifying concept, project characteristic? No, there was one even higher. And it was community projects. Now, there were relatively few of these, but boy, those students who were engaged in projects such as volunteering saw these as extraordinarily self-defining. What wasn't self-defining? Reading. Now, I have to say, this is before Harry Potter, so this may change. And one of the things about personal projects is that it is continually trying to pin down the contemporary facts. So instead of abstract scales, we look at what people are appraising their everyday deeds and doings. Reading then was pretty low. Estate, this is just a dignified way of saying clean up your room and rake up the leaves in the yard. Academic projects, that's sort of depressing, isn't it? 5.65. You look at that compared to such things as community and spiritual pursuit. It gives you pause for concern. And we did have one other category, which is anti-school projects, which are things like blowing up Mrs. Whittemore's chemistry lab. And we thought they may be a real expression of your idiosyncratic angst, but they weren't. In fact, these were things that other people enjoined you to do. Now, what is characteristic about those on the left-hand side and uncharacteristic of those on the right? I think it is being engaged in something where you're beyond yourself, where you care for something else. And notice that this is measuring self-identity. And, particularly team sports, relationships, spiritual and community volunteer quests in particular, are a way in which adolescents are able to say, this is really me. So whereas some crude accounts of, say, Ericksonian identity theories might say that you need to have a clear sense of self in order to give to others, what I and my students are feeling and believing on the basis of this and other kinds of data is that maybe the self and the other are co-constituted. It is in seeing what I'm like with others that I am able to get a sense of who I truly am myself. I'm not going to discuss more methodology except to say that we look at context of projects, how and why you're engaged in each of them, the cross impact, because we have more than one project, and we have a cross impact matrix that allows you to look at how your impact, how your project of getting good grades impacts with your project of keeping fit. We have joint cross-impact matrices. How do your projects interlace with those of your spouse or your boss or your kids? And we have a cumulative data bank, CBank, which some of my colleagues, Simon Colombe at the University of Quebec de Montreal, and others are helping me develop, and we want to make it open source and widely available over the next year or so. Intrapersonal projects is one paradoxical kind of project category that I want to just spend a couple of minutes on. An interpersonal project would be one like you saw before, which is try to be more extroverted. One of the findings by one of the most productive researchers in personal projects research, Caterina Salmello-Aro, who did a co-edited book with me and my wife, Susan Phillips, called Personal Project Pursuit, Goals, Action, and Human Potential. She's done some incredibly interesting research on interpersonal projects or self projects. And what she was able to show is that their frequency seems to be linked with depressive affect. And we've found similar evidence in our research in studies in Ottawa. However, in our lab, we've also found that intrapersonal projects are associated with creativity, and that people who are highly creative really identify with their interpersonal projects. I'll refer you to a dissertation by one of my students, Michelle Gordon, who has done a very interesting piece of research on that. Now, what is it about an intrapersonal project that can be depressogenic on the one hand or creatogenic on the other? And I believe it is the origin of that self-change project. Think of the difference between somebody telling you to be more outgoing and somebody, yourself, saying, boy, I think I'm going to have to change, and I want to change. On the one hand, you have the begrudging, and you can see DC and Ryan's theoretical work being very relevant here. On the one hand, you can see this is begrudgingly taken on. On the other hand, if you initiated it, and we have ways of measuring initiation, you're likely to make it a creative venture rather than a begrudging indulgence of somebody else's projects. I've skipped ahead there, and I'm just going to get me back. There we go. I'm going to wrap up very soon, but I want to tell you about our key theoretical proposition. Human flourishing comprises a sustainable pursuit of core projects in our lives. And core is critical, and sustainable is critical. Core personal projects are those which Bernard Williams, the philosopher, might have called ground projects. These are projects without which we may even consider whether we should carry on at all. These are the projects that, on reflection, really, really matter in our lives. And human flourishing, for me, comprises the sustainable pursuit of such projects. And this requires two different kinds of sustainability. One, we have to have sustainable pursuits that are internal, and so I see concordance between what you're pursuing in your projects and the big five personality traits is likely to lead to greater sustainability than if you're constantly acting out of character. Self-identity. I won't go into my anecdote about spit, but someday I may give you a talk in which I talk about the phenomenology of spitting. But I shan't now because I want to finish on time. Flexible construal. We can look at projects. I think of Coral White's wonderful example in the Man Gulch crisis, where firefighters had the project of containing the fire, but were unable to switch to a flexible reconstrual of the project, which was to escape when the wildfire got out of hand. So by looking at contain the fire, they kept carrying their heavy, heavy gear. If they had changed flexibly the nature of the project, the construal of the project, to escape, they would have gotten rid of their equipment and saved their lives, which alas they did not. There are studies. Michelle Seeger has done some interesting work on how you construe and how you actually advertise for fitness programs. Lose 10 pounds actually works well with men. Enjoying myself at fitness class is far more of an inducement for the women that she studied. And so the ability to shift your construal of the projects that you're attempting to carry out seems to be critical to sustainability. And externally, are there micro-level influences, meso in the middle? There are macro-level contexts that constrain or support. We found that micro-level partner support in childbirth was critical when we get hardcore measures, hard indicators of successful childbirth, like APGAR scores on the child, and also subjective measures of how happy was the mother postpartum. The best predictor was the support, emotional support of the partner. And Craig Dowden at Carleton did a very interesting PhD dissertation on partner support in entrepreneurs and found it was a significant predictor of the success of entrepreneurs. And it makes me think that entrepreneurs who say, oh man, this really is my baby. It may not just be a loose metaphor, but actually may conduce to the same kind of project excitement that occurs in pregnancy. The meso level, we found that men in particular in large-scale corporations are particularly concerned about impedance. For them, the best organizational climate change will be to get rid of people in the way of my projects, clear the floor. Whereas for women, it seemed to be more about connection. And we thought, my wife and I, Susan Phillips, did a study on gender differences, but we did something, I think, a little trickier. It wasn't just gender. In fact, it may not have been gender at all. The people in these studies were influenced by the politics of the day. And most of the junior people and the people in the companies and the crown corporations at the lower echelons were women. And we think it may be a newcomer effect, that newcomers have to look for sources of support. They need to find out the lay of the political land. And so it could be not gender so much as status that's really in play here. And finally, there's some wonderful work by David Frost from my British colleagues, not the political journalist, but the positive psychologist now at the University of Surrey, more recently at, or just before that at Columbia University, who has looked at the political facilitation of personal projects in LBGT individuals, and has found that the political facilitation of projects, or its frustration through political issues relating to marriage, say, was critical. And he's done a wonderful piece of research and is heading up a major study of such issues in England coming out. I want to close by looking at acting out of character. I talked about free traits, and I'll end with an example of my own behavior. I am a very introverted person. Many of you are, like I am, but I have a project that matters dearly to me, and that is I'm a professor, and I want to profess. And that means I have to act out of character and be seen by my students, I guess. Excuse me, as a bit of an extrovert. And yet, what this does is it does two things. It allows some benefits. It allows me to get some success in my personal project, or to reach the goal of the project, to engage my students. But there can be a cost. We have published something which will be in the reference list on how acting out of character has the potential for causing burnout. But if we have what I call restorative niches, in which you can regain your first nature, excuse me, then that burnout might be mitigated. And my example of this is that I used to go down to the Department of National Defense in Saint-Jean, Quebec, in Canada, lecturing colonels who were about to become generals but didn't know it. And I would lecture for 3 hours in the morning, and then a break, and then 2 hours in the afternoon. It was pretty exhausting, so I needed it as an introvert. Overloading and stimulation, I needed to go for a walk by the Richelieu River, which ran by the campus. And that worked out fine. That was my restorative niche, because I was acting out of character, and I needed that restoration. But the campus moved from the river stayed where it was, so unfortunately, I had to find another place to go, and there was a men's room. I may actually have a picture. I do have a picture of it here. This is at the top are the cubicles, and the side are the urinals. For those of you familiar with this configuration, I went where any self-respecting introvert would go, which is as far away as possible. But we're always keen to have our sensors detect incoming extroverts, real extroverts, not pseudo-extroverts, as I am and perhaps you are. And I heard one coming. Ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. He's about to go into cubicle next to me. Well, actually, he started in cubicle 2, and I could see his feet because I was looking underneath. And then he started, bah, 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 bah. There he is. And I heard, my heart's already pounding in here. And then I heard various, how to put this felicitously, various evacuatory noises, utterly unmuffled. And then this gravelly voice comes through and says, "Is that Dr. Little?" For introverts, if anything is guaranteed to constipate us for 6 months, it's talking on the John. So what I do now, as a pseudo-extrovert trying to muddle through life in its vicissitudes, when I go to the men's room, I put my feet up. These days, a real extrovert's going to come from the urinal, come underneath and say, "Gotcha," and that will be the day I die. Thank you.
Wow, that's awesome. What a way to close, Brian. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
That's awesome. And I want people to take a peek right now at 2 fantastic books. Me, Myself, and Us is something that I have right on my shelf here. It's a great, great book and very accessible. Personal Project Pursuit is a great research book, wouldn't you say, Brian? But
yes.
It's more academic than the Me, Myself, and Us, which is something that everybody can read.
That's true, although I think positive psychologists might enjoy several chapters in Personal Project Pursuit. There's some wonderful chapters on cultural aspects of Project Pursuit, particularly with respect to what in Canada we call First Nations people, and others, Native Americans, for example, and Indigenous folks, depending on different terminology for different sensibilities. And there's a wonderful chapter on that. There's also a wonderful chapter by an ex-student and colleague of mine, Ian McGregor, splendid chapter on passion in Personal Project Pursuit. So they may enjoy that as well, but if you really want the research base of projects analysis, this is the book to have, yeah.
No, that's great. Well, thank you for sharing that. You know better than anyone what's inside those covers. And I want to share with the people, Brian, people are pretty excited about your presentation because I think it touches a chord or strikes a chord where it's something that we can all relate to. And
Great.
So I have a question. We have a couple questions that have come in, and I invite other folks right now to send questions in. Brian, your popularity is asking whether or not you can stay on for a few extra minutes. We usually stop right at the top of the hour, but are you free for a couple extra minutes?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I'm fine. So just carry on.
All right. Well, we appreciate that.
Yeah.
And of course, for anyone that has to depart at the top of the hour, we understand, but we want to give you some of this bonus time, sort of like the professor who's willing to stay and answer questions after class.
Exactly.
And with that, I must tell you that Tal Ben-Shahar, all of us on the call know Tal and his work, and was worked with Brian directly at Harvard. And he said one of the greatest compliments, I thought, is that oftentimes people are known for saying, "Hey, how you doing?" as just a greeting. But Brian, this is what Tal said at the International Positive Psychology Congress in the hallway. He said, if Brian asks you, he'll say, "How are you doing?" No, "How are you really doing?" Because Brian really wants to know.
That's really touching, David. I was lucky. We were talking about this before, that I had in my class Adam Grant, and in the same class, Adam Grant and Sean Aker and Tal Ben-Shahar. And those were the ones that had a combustibility coefficient that was mind-boggling, and I was terribly lucky to be in the same room with those guys. I often talked in that class about saying to students, how are you doing? And then sometimes they would, well, usually they would say fine. And then I would, one day I just happened to say, "No, really, how you doing?" And then they would say, "Well, really, my boyfriend's gone to Stanford. Why is my stats prof systematically destroying every shred of my soul? My parents are divorcing," and all of a sudden what really mattered in their life started tumbling out. And so my admonishment to my fellow professors and those of you in positive psychology is try to stop the normal bantery. "So how's it going?" "Great. How are you?" "Awesome." And just say, "No, really, David, how are you?"
Isn't that awesome? That's one of the things. It's not a requirement of researchers and professors to practice the essence and spirit of positive psychology, but it sure is refreshing, Brian, when leaders like you demonstrate that you do live the principles that we share with people around the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. By the way, someone just suggested that they had heard Adam Grant saying that he considers you as being his #1 mentor. So there you go.
I was very, very lucky to have Adam Adam was an honors student of mine at Harvard, and it was it was pretty remarkable. Someday I will tell you stories about Adam Grant, but not. He is a phenomenal man. Yes.
Yeah, he's a great guy. He's a great guy. So a couple questions, additional questions for you. One question comes from Vanessa King, and she asked this question.
Oh, hi, Vanessa.
Yeah, she's awesome as well.
Yes.
What's the connection, she asks, or overlap with intrinsic motivation and self-determination theory?
There's a lot of overlap with self-determination theory. Let me deal with that one. Ken Sheldon and Andrew Elliott, who've done some terrific work in that, in DC and Ryan's theoretical framework, came up to Canada and had a couple of days session with us, and they had actually been using personal projects as the way of looking at longitudinal change in students. And they were the ones who were able to show the importance of having self-determined projects as a prospective predictor of well-being. And DC and Ryan and our group have overlapped frequently and cite each other frequently as well. So I see personal projects as a way of operationalizing some of the theoretical notions that are stimulated by DC and Ryan, the self-determination work. We've also got independent evidence of Bob Vallerand's work on the two-factor theory of passion in our own work of looking at passionate project pursuits. So there's a lot of interdigitation between the self-determination people and our approach.
That's awesome. Another question's come in from Jenny Ullman, and she says, Brian, can an extrovert act out of character and go deeply into analysis as a way to reach important goals?
Oh, this is fascinating in two respects. First of all, any of those big 5 dimensions can be the cause of an individual acting out of character. An agreeable person may, excuse me, have to be disagreeable because their mom has been having difficulties yet again in the care facility. And so for all of August, you have been pushy and even insensitive in order to advance a core project of helping mom get what she really needs. And so, so you can be agreeable and act disagreeably. You can be a naturally disagreeable person, and because you want to keep your job, you have to act out of character as a pleasant person, very similar to the emotional labor work that is studied in sociology. Extroverts can act out of character as introverts. And in fact, one of the most fascinating pieces of research has been carried out both by researchers at Wake Forest and up here at Carleton. Bill Fleeson on the one hand, or Will Fleeson on the one hand, and John Zelensky up here, and Deanna Whalen, one of his doctorates. And they've been showing that counter to what I had anticipated, it may be actually more difficult for an extrovert to act introvertedly than an introvert to act extrovertedly. And I posit, for example, that protractedly acting out of character, either as a pseudo-introvert or a pseudo-extrovert or a pseudo-pleasant person or a pseudo-conscientious person, any of the big five options, can be doable and can advance our core projects, as the question raised. But we need to be very careful that we not burn out and that we find restorative niches. And one of my students at Cambridge, a doctoral student right now, is just wrapping up her studies. Sana Balsiri-Palsuli has done some intriguing work confirming what Will Fleeson and Zelensky and his Carleton colleagues have found, that extroverts may find it more difficult acting as introverts when their work culture demands it. So we're continuing those studies and excited to join with those of you who have interests to study large organizations.
Oh, that's awesome. We have a question that we know we said we'd take on another call, but just along the lines, this is Angus Skinner calling in from overseas, and he said that I'm very interested in the issue mentioned about spitting, and the question is this, and he's like, and I know Angus is a good guy, he probably can do a good job. The question really he asks is this, or does this have to do with disgust?
In a way it does. Have we time for one brief anecdote?
Absolutely.
Okay. It was my daughter's 7th birthday. This is in one of the second to last chapter of my book, Me, Myself, and Us. And just before, in fact, I have it here, and I'm going to read this to you, and this will only take 2 minutes and 18 seconds, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great.
So here it goes. Here it is. It was my daughter's. She was 7 years old. No, 10th birthday party. It changes every year, I find. And about half an hour before the party began, she approached me with a strange request. Would I hypnotize the guests and turn them into various barnyard animals? Of course, I declined for 17 reasons, including ethical, legal, and practical ones. Example, one of the cows started chewing on the chickens. She was very disappointed, but tried another tack. Would I do something that kids would find interesting, something psychological? Gulping because 10-year-old girls can be more challenging than a room full of dyspeptic neuroscientists, I tried to think of something interesting to do for the delightful but daunting partygoers. We gathered in the kitchen, and I asked for a volunteer. Jennifer volunteered. All 10-year-old girls in 1980 in North America were called Jennifer, except my daughter. I gave her the following instructions. Okay, Jennifer, I want you to get some spit in your mouth. I demonstrated with exaggerated mouth movements, which they somehow found funny. And she followed by making her own. Good wad. Now swallow it. Jennifer complied, looking rather confused. I then asked her whether it felt strange or uncomfortable. Or as Angus might say, was it sort of gross? And she responded that it didn't. Apparently, she had swallowed on previous occasions. So far, this is profoundly uninteresting, and I barely glanced at my daughter, who was showing incipient signs of mortification. But then I took out a sparkling clean glass. placed it in front of Jennifer, and asked her once again to get some spit in her mouth. She did. Now spit into the glass. She did. Now drink it. Gross! No way! They all recoiled at the prospect of drinking their own spit. So I asked them why it was so gross compared with the normal act of swallowing. Another Jennifer had a very clever idea. She suggested that in normal swallowing, the spit was warm, but in the glass, it was cold, and this made it gross. So I suggested we heat up the glass of spit. Would it be easier to drink then? Ew! There's a consensus sentiment. The little demonstration seemed to be sufficiently interesting that my daughter continued talking to me, and as a bonus, I didn't need to clean up after any barnyard animals. So there, Angus, I hope that answers your question.
That's awesome. You know, I was just thinking that what people pay every year for being a member of the International Positive Psychology Association, the value has just increased where we had a performance artist. That was awesome. What a great leader.
Thank you.
And Angus, thanks for providing the opportunity for us to share that.
Great question, Angus. Yes.
We have time just for one last question.
Sure.
And what I want to just share with people before we close is that a recording and the PowerPoint today and bibliography will be posted on the ipanetwork.org website. So keep an eye out for that, as well as an email that will come to let you know that. And then, Brian, for additional questions that people have, can they send you had mentioned the possibility of sending an email to you.
Sure. Do they have that up?
You know, I don't think it's
screen?
up right now. I wonder if you might just say it out loud, and we'll follow back up with that.
Sure. By all means, my Gmail account is brian.little. These are all small letters, at gmail.com. So brian.little.psych@gmail.com.
That's great. That's super. So here's the final question. The question is around application and any advice or guidance or resources you could point us to where people can better train and guide people how to really utilize the power of personal projects in their lives at work and at home.
You know, it's a very timely question. I'm about to spend a year zooming in precisely on that. And I have some colleagues and students who are willing to work with me on converting this into. We've already had ways of doing it on the computer, and it's been used extensively in interview sequences. And I've got some references to that in the list that I'll make available.